Hello everyone, so we're going to continue with the first chapter, and next thing we're going to talk about are these things called planes. So planes is another term where if you look it up in a regular dictionary, you'll talk about airplanes, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about two-dimensional thing that's called frontal plane here in this section. So it separates the tissues or the body into anterior and posterior sections. So why do we want to talk about this? So if you're going to cut the body into uh, or cut into the body, you need to be able to describe what view you're looking at. Or if you're going to go into radiology, the radiology tech needs to write down which view the image they're showing, or when they're labeling the images, they need to be able to label it correctly. So cutting the body or separating the body from and the front and back is the frontal plane. So it's going to, separate the front and back, and the two-dimensional flat surface that we are looking at. So the first plane is the frontal plane. The frontal plane is basically going to separate the anterior from the posterior. So basically, if you had separated this part of the body from the back of the body. So if you were to go ahead and take a cadaver and, cut them right down the middle and able to take the front away from the back, that's going to be the frontal plane. And it's basically named after a bony marking that's on the skull here. So the bony markings on the skull, there are a couple things there. There are sutures, and one of them is called the coronal suture, and that's where it comes from, the term. So this is a coronal plane, or for example, over here the name is frontal plane, and the other one is called coronal plane because coronal suture. So here there are two terms, a frontal or coronal plane. So you can either call it a frontal plane or you can call it a coronal plane. So coronal suture goes across the head almost as if you had a crown. And that's where if you had a tiara, that's where it's gonna sit. It's gonna sit on the coronal suture, and that's where you want to cut down. So the image is showing you the frontal plane, and that's what you see if you feel like if you do a MRI or an X-ray. So next thing we have is going to be looking at the sagittal plane. Sagittal plane is basically going to be between the eyes here. And you separate the right side from the left side, and that's going through the sagittal plane. And this is again named after the bony marking that's on the skull that's called sagittal suture. And the name comes from the suture. So you don't have to go between the eyes. If you go between the eyes, you have a special term called mid-sagittal plane because it creates an equal right and left. So the equal right side from the left side, that's why it's called a mid-sagittal. On the other hand, if you go down a little bit to the side, not exactly from the middle, then it's called parasagittal. It misses the midline, separating the right and left portions in unequal sizes. So if you have, military, and then there's paramilitary. The paramilitary be the extra military that the mercenaries that you pay for supporting your real military. So para stands for a type of design, or in this case, cutting between the eyes that gives you mid-sagittal. But if you were to go a little bit to the side and not cut equal halves, then it's parasagittal. Maybe if you were to lop off the arm, that's parasagittal. It's just a little bit off from the midline. So mid-sagittal, equal left and right sections, parasagittal, parallel section to the midline. So this is the sagittal plane, and that's the median plane, frontal plane, and then the horizontal plane. third one, which is easy to understand, is transverse plane. The first plane is when you separate so transverse plane is when you separate the top from the bottom. Very easy to understand. So you separate the top from the bottom. One place we can do that is at the hips. So right here. And so if you got here now, you have equal halves top and equal half bottom. If you decapitate uh, somebody, that's called transverse plane because you separate the top from the bottom. If you go ahead and cut off the legs from the knee, you also have created a transverse plane. So this is important because if you're going to be a radiology tech, you need to go ahead and create this image either through X-ray or MRI, and you labeled it incorrectly, then you send it to the doctor. That's going to create confusion. So this is really important that we are able to know all the terminology at every step of the treatment for the patient, because if there were something that's mislabeled, anybody in the team can identify and be able to correct it. So it's pretty important that you guys need to know this right now, because if you're going to continue being in the health field, everybody on the team needs to be able to talk and describe about the anatomical structures. So here's the definition. Transverse or horizontal cross section is at the right angle to the front and sagittal planes, and sections typically pass through the head and trunk regions. Last thing we're going to talk about is the cavities. I think that's the next slide. We have one more plane, which is the oblique plane. So this is a really unique one. This is called oblique plane, and the word oblique means diagonal. And so you just basically cut a diagonal line. So like this is diagonal here. So if you cut something diagonal, you cut something obliquely. So over here, you can see the leg has been cut obliquely. And the reason why you might want to do that is because you want to see what's happening at each level. So we want to see what's happening in the tissue here versus in the, in the tissue here versus in the middle and on the bottom. So you can cut multiple sections. But this is used in very unique situations, but you see that's the term in case you need to use it in the future. Next thing we have are the cavities. So you got two basic cavities. So cavity in this situation means space. So let me write that. So cavity means space. If you Google the term cavity, it's going to refer to tooth decay and things like that. In this case, we're not talking about tooth decay. We're talking about empty space in your body that's going to hold things. It's going to hold your organs and things of that sort. And the empty spaces have names. So let's go and talk about these cavities. So we have two basic cavities. You got yourself a posterior cavity. And the posterior is same thing as dorsal. You might be asking which one do we need to know for the exam. So I have to say that you need to know both of them. The reason why you need to know both of them is because literature is always going back and forth between posterior and dorsal. So if you only learn one of them, then you're going to get pretty confused. If you were to read about this stuff in the future, so you need to know both of them, posterior or dorsal in this case. Posterior cavity is shown in yellow here. And this is the anterior. There are multiple cavities here, or ventral body cavity, that are part of the ventral body cavity. So we do have these color coded here. So the anterior cavity is same as the ventral, means the belly is going to be shown in red over here. If anybody here taking my class and they have color blindness, please let me know, because many of the structures are identified using colors. And sometimes on the quizzes and exams, I will use the colors to indicate certain things. So if you know that you're colorblind, please let me know so I can go ahead and use different ways to indicate those structures. Now the posterior cavity or the dorsal cavity. So let's talk about posterior dorsal cavity. Let me clear the, so dorsal body cavity, there are two parts to it. cranial cavity that contains the brain, vertebral cavity that contains the spinal cord. So there's this big space. There are two subcategories of dorsal body cavity. There's this big space that holds the brain. That's called cranial cavity. Cranial refers to the part that houses your brain. So you can see that if you took if you took the brain out, there would be a big empty space. So that's the cranial cavity. That's part of the posterior cavity. Now this space is connected to the other space here, where you have your spinal cord, or that's where the spinal cord is going to be. So if you take the spinal cord out, there's going to be space or cavity that's called spinal cavity because spinal cord is going to be residing there. So that's vertebral cavity that contains spinal cord, and both of these are part of the dorsal body cavity. Heading over to the front now, anterior cavity is going to be broken down into subcategories. The first one is here called thoracic. So thoracic, that contains the heart and lungs. And then in this case refers to the rib cage. So the thoracic refers to or relates to the rib cage. So I'm not calling it the chest, I'm calling it thoracic and the thing that's associated with the ribs or the rib cage. So you point it to from the front and that's still thorax. If you point to this from the back, it's still called thorax because you have the ribs in the front. So you have ribs and this is called thoracic cavity, and that's going to be housing the heart and the lungs. And then there's this muscle called diaphragm, and the diaphragm will split the thoracic cavity and separate it from the cavity that's down below. And it's inferior, this cavity is inferior to the diaphragm, and that's your abdominal cavity. In your abdominal cavity, that's where you're going to have your soft organs like intestines, your stomach, your liver, your kidneys. And then we have another separation here, right here. And that's separating abdominal cavity from the cavity beneath. That's right behind your genitals. So that's the empty space that's called pelvic cavity. And the pelvic cavity contains the bladder, the reproductive organs, the rectum, and your urinary organs. And that's where your urinary bladder is going to be. So that's pretty far down in your body, and that's going to be called the pelvic cavity. So we need to be able to memorize all of these. And later when we talk about the organs, knowing these cavities will help you better visualize what's going on over here. So this was a short lecture. So this is thoracic and abdominal cavity and pelvic cavity. So this was a little bit shorter lecture than the other chapters. So chapter 2, that's going to be review of the cell, especially the animal cell. Then the one after that's going to be chapter 3, and we're going to be talking about tissues. And then after that, we have the integumentary system. So thank you guys for listening.